Okay, we are live. I am on air and I'm just waiting for Jason to pop in.
Yep. Can you
There
hear
you
me?
are. I can hear you just
Great.
okay. So here we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Paleo, and welcome to Mage the Podcast, the show dedicated to all things mage. And our guest on today's show is Jason Louv, who is a real-life magician and writer, and his most recent book is John Dee and the Empire of Angels, Enochian Magick, and the Occult Roots of the Modern World. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic to talk to you again. As I mentioned in our pre-show chatter, I actually interviewed you maybe about 10 years ago when we were talking about your book, Generation Hex.
Yeah, that's so crazy. That was my first book that came out, and what was that? That must have been like 2005. And I think I was probably 23 at the time and getting, very, just jumping into the deep end of writing and publishing and promoting. And yeah, that was a long time ago, man. It's amazing that we're back at it. I had no idea that you were a Mage guy also.
Well, I'm actually new to Mage, and but I heard an interview you did with Satyros some months ago, and just doing that in preparation for this show. And I thought, you know what, I should have Jason on the show, especially since you're doing this book tour for your book about John Dee.
Totally. Well, that's crazy. You're new to it. Yeah, I interviewed Phil Bricado on the Ultraculture podcast, which is please people listening, check it out on iTunes. It's back in full force, going strong. But yeah, Mage was a huge. I first got my hands on a copy of Mage: The Ascension, the White Wolf role playing game, when I was in 8th grade, I think. Somebody,
Whoa.
or no, 7th grade. 7th grade. Somebody, actually, one of my friends who was the son of the school gym teacher had a copy of it, and I remember reading it in the back of homeroom or math class or something like that. And just the first, and it's okay, like, okay, yes, it's quote unquote a role playing game, but I mean, just the first few pages of it, this was first edition, the paperback, and just the first few pages, they're quoting like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, talking about how reality is constructed by language, and if you wake up to the true nature of reality, you too can shape reality. And this was like the proverbial diamond bullet to the forehead, like Marlon Brando says in Apocalypse Now. And this changed my life. It really did. I mean, I was already into all the other White Wolf role-playing games, but that one completely changed my life because I could see how it was obviously a game, and it was fictional and all that, and it's not like I had any problem distinguishing reality and fantasy. But I was a smart kid into, weird outsider, not particularly socially well-adjusted kid into H.P. Lovecraft and Dune and early hacker culture, or 90s hacker culture, and role-playing games and White Wolf. But that book Mage really, the game Mage, the books really brought it all together for me. And it's interesting you mentioned interviewing Phil, because when I talked to Phil, who of course was the developer for Mage 2nd Edition, and talking to those guys, I asked him about my long-standing speculation, where I was saying, look, I mean, you guys had to be like kind of like stoned out, like hippie new age goth guys in the 90s trying to sneak all the stuff that you were actually interested in into a role-playing game for kids. And he was like, yeah. And I've heard him on a podcast saying they were all on acid nonstop doing that game or something like that. I don't want to speak out of turn, but it was just clear that it was clear to me, even at the time, as I began to continually read the books, that game was written by people who were into, really far out stuff and real magic and things like that. And they were doing it in a fictional context. But, honestly, looking back at those books, not only did they sneak in so much real magical information, but they just had a awesome aesthetic, like all those Leif Jones drawings and things like that. I feel like Mage is a great underappreciated artwork, as is the whole White Wolf universe, but particularly Mage. I mean, the aesthetic of Mage I've carried through me for my entire life, which is by and large been an attempt, as I told Phil, my entire life has been an attempt to run a a one-person mage LARP, which is so convincing that everyone else believes it and actually goes along with it, so that consensus reality shifts so that people will allow me to be a magician, which has actually kind of worked.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. I want to talk about all things Mage, but I think for our listeners and for myself, because I asked this question of you years ago, which is, what is magic? But let's reframe that. In your definition, what is magic, and how is it different, or how is it the same in Mage?
Well, as you know, I write about magic a lot, and I now teach magic at my school, magic.me. That's magic with a K. And, I've taught tens of thousands of students all over the world how to do magic. One thing I always say to my students is, whenever I define magic, whatever I say, that is the ultimate end-all, be-all definition of magic. This is the ultimate definition of magic. And that's what I say every time I define magic, but every time I define it as something else. But, so what is magic? Well, how am I feeling this morning? Magic is, here's my current definition of magic. And of course, as you do lots of spiritual practices and have magical experiences, it does change because reality is an evolving process. There aren't fixed rules to it, despite whatever governments, false science and, religions would have us believe. Magic is a spontaneously emergent principle of the universe, of nature, and of human beings. It's the way in which reality manifests, and almost spontaneously. And more specifically, for human beings, magic is the meaning-making faculty of human beings. It's how we attribute meaning to our own subjective experience. It's how we attribute meaning to the world and the universe and history. And really, the universe is infinite, but human beings are meaning-making animals. We are time-binding creatures. We are, that's what we do. As a snail builds a shell, a spider weaves a web. Human beings create meaning and stories about what they're experiencing. Sometimes those meanings and stories are so elaborate and convincing and appealing that other people play along with them. And sometimes whole cultures play along with these stories over thousands of years even. And that's how culture is created. But all of this emerges from the spontaneous reaction of human beings to their experience. Now, unfortunately, most human beings in the world, let's say 99.9%, don't understand that everything's a story. They think that all the stories out there, whether it's what was told to them by the media or by religion or government or whatever, their family, their local group, whatever they've been told reality is, that's what reality is. They haven't realized that it's just a story somebody came up with, whether that's the story of the progress of civilization, the story of a religion, the story of what's going on in America in 2018, or whatever it happens to be. People believe other people's stories. A magician, quote unquote, is somebody who realizes through spontaneous insight or life experience or being educated roughly in the school of hard knocks, that not only is everything a story, that nothing is true, in the sense that everything is subjective meaning projected on top of what might be objective truths in the universe that we might be able to perceive through mathematics and science and that type of thing. But for the most part, almost all human activity is just stories that people are making up. A magician is somebody who A, realizes that, and then B, begins to write their own story for their own life.
That is an excellent definition, and I know you will change it next time. But you got me thinking, and this has never occurred to me before, but what is the relationship of magic to postmodernism? Because in a lot of ways they seem very similar, because it was all about deconstructing the myths of reality or how people govern themselves.
That's a great question, and it's one that's quite topical right now, as we're seeing this cultural level backlash against postmodernism. Through people like Jordan Peterson and people like that who clearly have no understanding what postmodernism actually is. But I'm also critical of postmodernism, but I want to go forward through postmodernism, not backwards away from it. So postmodernism is deconstructionism and critical theory and all of these things that have emerged in academia and the academy over the last several decades, and things like from places like the Frankfurt School and things like that are a great advance in human comprehension, because, I mean, without getting into a tangent, some of the core ideas of postmodernism and critical theory are that everything is socially constructed. Things, meaning, there's no grand meaning, there's no master narrative for civilization or what human lives should be. And these things can be picked apart, criticized, deconstructed, looked at from different angles. These grand stories, we can consider bringing in, well, hang on, all these big stories about what reality is, have been written by people with power, people in privileged places in society. And we're only getting this tiny keyhole in the human experience because only certain people have been able to, have access to telling stories. And now, as electronic communication is not only bombarding us with an onslaught of new information, but democratizing the tools for people to tell their stories and for us to receive those stories, the narrative has broken down. And so postmodernism, without overly generalizing, some of the core things that emerge from it are the idea that it's kind of what I was saying. Everything is a story. That story can be deconstructed, warped, remixed, cut up, rearranged in new fashion. We can tell new stories from new perspectives, and that to a large extent, all of this stuff is relative, and that's incredibly liberating, because it liberates us because we have to remember what this was a reaction to. I mean, this postmodern theory, critical theory, the Frankfurt School, happened after World War II. Humanity went through World War II, and they saw the worst war the world has ever known, in concentration camps and tens of millions of deaths and atomic bombs. And people looked at this and said, this is what happens when people think stories are so real, whether that's a story about the story Hitler told, or the story that of empire, and all these stories that allowed people to kill each other in the tens of millions. And people were looking at that and saying, we need to make sure this never happens again. We need to undermine fascism. And there was an understanding that fascism was the total belief in a master narrative so strong that you were willing, not just willing to kill for it, but willing as a culture to kill at the level of tens of millions. And so postmodernism is really a reaction to that, and now the other side of this is that they get prior to postmodernism, because they have found that they've deconstructed everything to the point where nothing's left. And of course, then we end up in nihilism and a lack of meaning, and what's, what magicians refer to in the Kabbalah as the sphere of Thoth, or knowledge, meaning just information disconnected from any ordering principle. Now, unfortunately, in the current moment, with the rise of the alt-right and Trump and kind of pseudo academics like Jordan Peterson, we see people trying to reestablish a master narrative and go back to what things were like in the 1950s, or with the Dark Enlightenment. We see people trying to turn back the clock to before the French Revolution, before the Enlightenment, which is a very disturbing trend in what's going on in the world right now, although perhaps it's just an allergic reaction and we'll pass through it, and it's part of the process. Now, in terms of magic and things like that, to wrap this up, my take on it is postmodernism is part of the process. Okay, so it's just like what I said when you first asked me what magic is. First, we have to disintegrate other people's imposed narratives on us, but then we have to create our own stories. We have to take control of making meaning for ourselves. Now, unfortunately, this takes a lot of effort. Or fortunately, it's not an easy task. It sounds good. It sounds like, oh yeah, I'm in control, I'm free. But making your own meaning for your life and charting your own course through this existence is quite hard, and of course, ultimately rewarding. But most people would much rather check out, believe, and just go along with what they're seeing on Netflix, whatever their boss is telling them. Rather just check out and go with the flow. But as always, the world is open for magicians to wake up and take control of their own existences, and we of course hope that this will happen on the mass level. But it is perhaps overestimating people to think that everyone's going to do that. But that's my take on postmodernism, and a good way to think about it is if you look at the classic image of Baphomet, the image, the idol of the magician. On one side, on one arm, he has the word salve written. So salve means disintegration. And on the other one, he has coagula written. Coagulation is the two steps of the alchemical process. So you disintegrate all of the meanings that have been imposed on you from outside, and then you recoagulate your own meaning for your own life on your own terms. It's like destruction, preservation, and creation in Hinduism, the god Shiva.
Before we go any further, I want to invite listeners to participate in today's show by texting us any questions or messages you may have. All right, let's change topics a little bit. Your most recent book is called John Dee and the Empire of Angels, Enochian Magick, and the Occult Roots of the Modern World. And here's a part where I ask you, what's the book about? But as you said, you've been doing a book tour for like the last 4 months, so I think you can really distill it down to its bare essence. What is this book about?
Okay, so what is John Dee and the Empire of Angels about? So it's a biography of Dr. John Dee, who was the court astrologer and scientific advisor to Queen Elizabeth I in the 1500s. He's the person that is responsible for creating the modern world, in my opinion, who laid the groundwork for not only the modernization of mathematics and science, but also created the British Empire. He coined the term British Empire and laid out the schematics for it to happen, and also spent 10 years speaking to angels through occult rituals, which gave him the schematics for bringing about the end of the world. Now, what is it really about? John Dee and the Empire of Angels is really a history of the last 500 years of how the occult has influenced the modern world. It's about the secret history of the world, everything that's been going on behind the scenes, how magicians have created and structured everything we see around us, from the modern scientific worldview to the existence of the British and American empires at all, to modern the foreign policy of America, modern geopolitics. So what does that mean? What is it really about? So what it's really about is how magic is real, how your entire life is shaped by magic, and about how you too might need to become a magician to wake up from the nightmare of history, as James Joyce put it.
When I asked you to come on the show, I originally wanted to talk about how storytellers could incorporate Enochian Magick in the Chronicles based on your book, but you said that would be irresponsible. What did you mean by that?
Well, Enochian Magick is not a toy. It's Enochian Magick is real, and it's real enough that people approaching it in a non-structured way, or for instance trying to use the Enochian language just as a prop or something like that, run the risk of actually causing things to happen. And when you do Enochian Magick in the proper and structured way, and you approach it, it's a very, very serious thing. It's an incredibly high octane and potent spiritual path. And when you approach it in a real and structured way and are prepared to pay the personal costs necessary, because there are very high personal costs associated with any magic, but particularly Enochian. When you're prepared to do that, the cost, of course, being the loss of your illusions about who you are to begin with. When you're prepared to do that, well, then Enochian it's certainly not for everyone, but it is a working, very profound and beautiful and effective spiritual system and path. But we see people running into trouble when they take it out of context, when they chop it up, mix and match it. Even the Golden Dawn ran into trouble because they tried to make their own version of it, and that's even in an occult context. So it's just it's not a toy. That's my take on it. Now, I mean, in terms of incorporating the ideas of what's going on around it and things like that without approaching the actual system. That's another thing, and I think anyone who's interested in Mage, particularly Mage the Sorcerer's Crusade, who's done, this book is the treasure trove of information about, if you're doing a Sorcerer's Crusade chronicle. But anyone who's just interested in Mage and wants to know the real story about what magic actually is and how it shaped our world, which, by the way, is even more shocking and profound than even science fiction. It's amazing to me how reality really is like Mage in a way, not in a cartoony way, but in a deep and fundamental and philosophical way. So it will certainly be of inspiration to anybody who's interested in Mage. It'll be a pleasure and a joy to read, I think, and very eye-opening. But yeah, I mean, magic is a serious thing, and it shouldn't be taken out of context and used as a prop. But I laud anyone who's interested in it and who's interested in the real story.
What I think I should have done is ask this question first, which is, what is Enochian Magick?
Well, Enochian Magick, broadly speaking, is the system of magic that was delivered to Dee and Kelley by the angels that they were contacting over about 10 years. It is an incredibly potent and high-octane system of occult practice. It's, in my opinion, the most potent and high-octane. It's a method for contacting angels or otherworldly beings. It's a method for stretching towards what we might call the enlightenment experience. And it's an all-encompassing, obsessive, long-term path that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for personal illusions. It's not something that's good for instance, doing results magic and trying to get things, manifest things in your life. I mean, that's much lower magic. It's a form of magic that's concerned with waking you up, but waking up in the true sense, in the Mage sense, becoming awakened is quite painful and difficult. It's not as simple as, you wake up and then you get magical powers and now you're a great enlightened superhero. It's a lot different from that. It's very much the path of stripping away and losing all of one's illusions about what life is.
Now, to bring this back to Mage, and you said it would be irresponsible to try and incorporate Enochian Magick into Mage, but everyone plays Mage in their own way. Are there any suggestions or advice you'd offer listeners based on your own experiences that you think they might want to incorporate into their own chronicles?
Well, I mean, Mage in general, I mean, I had a ton of fun playing Mage in high school and junior high, but let's see, I mean, I don't know. I mean, when we look around at the modern world today, I mean, the modern world really is a Mage game. When we think about themes of the technocracy, technological control, the construction of reality. But it's really interesting because when Mage was written in the 90s, things were so different. In the 90s, there was, remember, we were just coming out of the end of the Cold War. There were state-backed philosophers like Francis Fukuyama telling us that we were in the end of history and that this was how things were. In reality, it was very static in a way. Now, everything has fallen apart. Everything is chaos. Everything is up for grabs, and we live in chaos and anarchy and the Hobbesian war of all against all. And that's a very frightening and sometimes exhilarating place to be. So in terms of, running Mage Chronicles, there's a lot of fertile ground for stories there. On the other hand, I mean, life is so crazy and dangerous and strange right now that all you have to do is look out the window to find yourself, or go online or step outside your front door to find yourself in a Mage game. And for me, taking Mage was like anything else. It's like it's something that you read when you're younger, and it's like when people read Lord of the Rings or Lovecraft or Dune or comic books, Alan Moore, The Invisibles, things like that, or whatever it happens to be in their younger days. They're shaped by those things, and Mage, I think, provides a very useful set of, it's a great training kit in a way. It's a great training module for seeing the world in a much more empowered and productive way. And just the idea that you can take control of your own life. And, magic, of course, is real. It's not real in the sense of people throwing fireballs out of their hands, or at least I've never seen that. But it is certainly real in the sense that we are all doing magic all the time. We're all both constructing meaning for ourselves and constructing meaning for the other people around us. And all you have to do is shift the world a few inches to the left, tilt the glass, as I say. A good storyteller shows you the world as it is, but just tilts the glass a few degrees. All you have to do is tilt the glass and look at the world and start thinking of, of course, we can look at Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is a magician in a sense. You look in his books and they're all full of quotes from Carl Jung. He was into New Thought and the power of positive thinking, and Norman Vincent Peale and all these things. I mean, this is a good example of somebody who uses magic to enforce their will on the world, and everyone is saying, oh, you can't do that, that's against the rules, and he just does it anyways. That's how magic works, but unfortunately he's doing very, very destructive things with it. So it's on down to us. It's up to everyone. It's down to all of us to become magicians and begin to push our meaning out into the world and construct reality for ourselves and for the people around us in more positive and hopeful and life-supporting ways, because there's just too much force on the other side right now. I mean, the technocracy is real, although they're not all bad. Lots of them are good. The Nefandi are most certainly real. Things like this, but as a metaphor, of course, Mage is a great way of metaphorically looking at the world as if everyone were a magician in a great war for reality. But that's how reality works. Reality does work on mage mechanics. It's just, it doesn't have the costumes and the special effects budget, but people certainly are engaged in a war for reality. And they have been for thousands of years, and that's really what John Dee and the Empire of Angels is about. It was about what the war for reality was in the 1500s. That's a real war, a war that, millions of people died in. And, existence, life is a competition between not just individuals, but groups of people and whole cultures to impose their meaning on the world. And so if you want to participate, then better wake up and participate. Or if you just want to escape from it, which is perhaps a healthier option, then wake up and plan your escape.
Well, they say history is a cycle, and we were talking earlier about the earlier 20th century with World War I and World War II, and how that just pulls reality. And it seems in our own way, we're repeating that cycle now, because as you said, things are anarchic. Everything's out of balance. So it's, as you said, it's time to grab the reins and impose our own reality, or share consensual reality, because that's what it's really all about. We only have a couple minutes left. So before we go, I wanted to touch briefly on the Ultraculture Podcast. Now, as I said, you interviewed Satoros a while ago, and recently you had Pam Grossman on the show to talk about magic and witches. Who are some of the guests you've had on the show in the past listening to?
You were breaking up a little bit at the end. I didn't hear anything after. Who are some of the guests you've had on in the past?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So who are some of the guests you've had in the past on the culture that Mage listeners might be interested in listening to those episodes?
Well, everyone, I think, because the podcast is largely focused around magic, and I've interviewed a ton of real-life magicians, if you will, people who are engaged in it, and there's a lot more to come. So I think everyone, but just let me look at the show list real quick. I mean, let's see. I mean, I just interviewed Lon Milo Duquette, who's probably one of the world's foremost experts on Enochian Magick. Mitch Horowitz I just interviewed, great writer about the history of the occult, how the occult has shaped the history of America. Zach Leary, Timothy Wiley, the late Timothy Wiley, who was one of the great psychonauts and magicians of our time. Stephen Edward Flowers, the real master of the runes and the Northern tradition. There's a lot of stuff, and I've got a ton that in the can that are coming out in the next few weeks. I just interviewed Gary Lockman, who is the author of several books, including Dark Star Rising, which is about how magic played a huge role in the presidential election with Trump and the alt-right and the Chans and things like that. And the interference of Russia and Alexander Dugin and all this stuff is a fascinating book, and we had a long conversation. I just interviewed Ralph Abraham, who's one of the founders of Chaos Mathematics, and spent a lot of time interested in John Dee and the occult as well. There's a ton. I've already got 6 episodes finished that are about to be released, and it's just going to get better and better. I'm putting a ton of effort into really mastering this craft of podcasting because people keep telling me, when the podcast was not running, they keep saying, when are you doing more podcasts? When are you doing more podcasts? They really, really wanted it. So I have to honor that and listen to that. And I've got a lot coming, and it's just going to keep getting better. But we're going to be exploring all the themes that Mage enthusiasts know and love, not just spirituality and magic, but the intersections of spirituality and magic with technology, the battles for reality as they currently stand, how we can survive as a human species, how we can bring ancient wisdom or spiritual wisdom or whatever you want to call it into our current hyper-mediated, hyper-technological world so that we can thrive and prosper and be healthy, and where magic and technology meet. I think that anyone who's into Mage, as I have been for my whole life, will immediately be on the same page. And if you're listening to this, I think we truly are kindred spirits because we have the same interests and the same backgrounds. So podcast is going to be a lot of fun. Of course, I also teach magic at magic.me, my school for magic. And if you're interested in that and learning real magic, I actually have a free introductory course to magic, which is a 7-day email course. You can get it, and it includes a book on sigils and podcasts and guided meditations and all kinds of cool stuff. People really love it. You can get that by texting the word shaman, SHAMAN, to the phone number 44222. It'll come back and ask for your email address. Put your email address in, and it'll send you the introductory book and sign you up for the course. It's great fun.
I'm really happy you're behind the microphone again. And if you'd like to learn more about you or buy your books or take your classes or listen to your podcast, where's the best place to find you?
So the best place is jasonlouv.com. So Jason, and my last name is spelled L-O-U-V. V is in Victor. So jasonlouv.com. And there's links to everything there. So, social media, the free class I mentioned, podcast, my classes, all my books, interviews with me, all kinds of fun stuff. So jasonlouv.com.
Thanks for joining us so much on Mage the Podcast.
Yeah, thank you. That was great fun. And thank you to listeners. And stay awake and watch out for paradox backlash.
So I strongly recommend you buy his book, John Dee and the Empire of Angels. It's on my stack. I am going to fucking crack it. Sorry, I have to finish reading this goddamn rule book that's 700 pages long. Of course, go take his classes, listen to his podcast. It's all fantastic. Now, join us again next week. Chris Sack, who's the moderator for the White Wolf RPG Playing Media Facebook. Talk about plot hooks that you can use in your next Chronicles. Find us online at magethepodcast.com or follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. And also check out our Twitter, Mage Chronicle. It's hashtag MTRPG. And right now, our players are about to go on a quest to talk to Elon Musk to help defeat the singularity. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and now on the TuneIn app. Give us a review or iTunes. It really helps people find the show. For Jason Louv, I'm Joseph Leo. See you next week.